G'day, it's James Muecke here. I'm Australian of the Year for 2020, and I'm looking forward to sharing my presentation, Blinded by Sugar. So let me go ahead and share the screen and we'll get started in just a moment. There we go. So I'm an ophthalmologist and I've been one for 30 years. And for 30 years, I've been dealing with the consequences that diabetes inflicts on the eyes. In fact, every year I'm seeing more and more patients who are losing vision, even going blind due to diabetes, in particular type 2 diabetes, which makes up 90% of all cases and is a preventable dietary disease related to the consumption of too much sugar in our modern diet. Can you even begin to imagine waking up completely blind? It's impossible to comprehend, isn't it? One of my patients has had exactly that experience. His name is Neil Hansell. An everyday Aussie bloke with a wife and 4 kids. He constructs light machinery for a living. And he also has type 2 diabetes. And a few years ago, at the age of 50, diabetes changed Neil's world forever. Unfortunately, he'd neglected his disease and he paid the price. He went to bed one evening with normal sight and woke up the next morning blind in both eyes. One of my colleagues worked really hard to try and retrieve his sight. Unfortunately, it was too late. Neil was to spend the rest of his life in darkness. And this is how Neil sees the world these days.
Basically, I think I would describe it as seeing everything as emotion, not as an actual vision. The images, unfortunately, aren't clear. The images are basically what you see of a day through your eyes is what you see of a night through your eyes. So there's no clarity. I see black figures as people or animals or trees, just black onto a greyish background.
Neil lost his driving licence, he lost his independence, and he lost his ability to teach the javelin. It was his hobby. In fact, it was a passion that gave him tremendous joy. But the thing that upsets Neil the most is that he can no longer see the beautiful smiles on the faces of his wife and grandkids. This is a picture of Neil's wife and 2 of his grandkids. This is how he should see them. And this is the reality. Neil has been irreversibly blinded by sugar. And sadly, Neil's not alone. He's just one of over 100,000 Aussies with sight-threatening eye disease due to diabetes. So how does diabetes threaten the sight? Well, it causes damage to the blood vessels throughout the body, including the retina, which is the light-sensitive layer of tissue that lights the inside of the backs of our eyes. This is a picture of the central vision area, what we call the macula, in a patient with type 2 diabetes. And this is that same eye a short time later. Diabetes can cause bleeding inside the eyes that can take away the eyesight in an instant and sometimes permanently. The really important point here is that nearly all of the loss of vision and blindness due to diabetes, 98%, is preventable or treatable. And yet to avoid the blinding consequences of this disease, patients with diabetes need to have their eyes checked on a regular basis. However, we know in Australia of the 1.7 million Aussies with diabetes, more than half are not having their regular, all-important, sight-saving eye checks. And that's why it's now become the leading cause of blindness amongst working-age adults in this country. It's also the fastest growing cause of blindness in Aboriginal people. So for me, as an eye specialist, to see people who go needlessly blind due to their diabetes, it upsets me greatly. The thing that makes me angry is that type 2 diabetes itself is a preventable disease. We should not be seeing it at all. This was a disease that was virtually non-existent in the 60s. In these days, we're seeing in the order of 250 new cases in Australia every single day. So today, I'm going to talk to you about diabetes, how it's arisen, why it's a growing epidemic, and I'm going to explore some strategies to curb the rising tide of this disease, which is a serious threat to our health system and to our society. And just to bring it into sharp focus, in the first 3 months of the coronavirus pandemic this year, there were 102 deaths due to COVID-19. Tragic deaths, of course. But in that same time period, we saw over 5,000 deaths due to type 2 diabetes. So I mentioned that type 2 diabetes is related to the ingestion of too much sugar in our modern diet. And when we talk about sugar, we think of table sugar, what we call sucrose. And this is the most common sugar additive in our food and drinks. But it's also important to remember that there are many other forms of sugar, and one of the most abundant are the refined carbohydrates, which are essentially sugar in disguise. And these are products like white flour, white rice, white potatoes. In essence, these are all pure starch, and starch are long chains of glucose, which are broken down into glucose when they reach the gut. So when you're ingesting refined carbohydrates, you're pretty much ingesting pure sugar. And our Australian Guide for Healthy Eating is full of products which are made from refined carbohydrates. White rice, white breads, pasta, white potatoes. And that guide also has products which are often high in sugar, such as tropical fruits, low-fat dairy, baked beans, and processed foods. And we cannot call processed foods healthy foods. So let's look at table sugar. So this is made up of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. And the body handles these two molecules in completely different ways. So let's look at glucose first. When glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream, it triggers the release of the hormone insulin from the pancreas. And that's what helps move that glucose into every cell of our body where it's either stored or used as an energy source. When I talk about glucose metabolism, I like to use the analogy of a subway train in Tokyo, where the train car is the body's cell, the passengers are the glucose molecules, and the conductor is the insulin. With prolonged and excessive glucose intake, the cells become full. The insulin level rises to try and move the glucose into the cell, but it gets to a stage when it can't push any more glucose into the cell, and we become what's called insulin resistant. And then we get an overflow of glucose into the bloodstream, where it's taken up by the liver and converted to glycogen. Glycogen stores are quite limited, and so the liver then starts turning the glucose into fat, which is exported away from the liver and stored in healthy fat cells throughout the body. It's kind of a protective mechanism. When the production of fat outstrips the ability of the liver to export it away, the liver then starts taking on the fat, and we develop what's called a fatty liver. And a fatty liver is central to the type 2 diabetes process. A normal healthy liver is a dark, deep red color, and you can see this liver is yellow because it's suffused with fat. A great example of a fatty liver comes from the French culinary delicacy foie gras, and that's created by force-feeding geese refined carbohydrates in the form of high-starch cornmeal. And a fatty liver can develop in these unsuspecting creatures within 10 to 14 days. In humans, with excessive fructose intake, a fatty liver can develop within a couple of months. So let's look at fructose. Fructose is that molecule of table sugar that gives sugary products their sweet flavour. It's not recognised as a foodstuff by the body. It doesn't trigger the release of insulin. It actually suppresses our appetite control system. And when it's absorbed into the bloodstream, it heads straight for the liver, where 30% is converted into fat. So it's far more toxic than glucose in giving rise to a fatty liver. This is a picture of a normal healthy liver. It's a pathological specimen. You can see the densely packed cells. And here is a fatty liver. You can see it's distended, and those white spaces are cells which are full of fat. It takes on average 13 years after the development of insulin resistance and a fatty liver to develop type 2 diabetes. However, in children, we can see type 2 diabetes developing within 2 years. So what ultimately happens is that the liver stores of fat become saturated, and then the liver exports the fat away from the liver as triglyceride. And triglyceride is harmful to the body. The high triglyceride level in the blood combined with the high insulin level is what gives rise to the fatty plaques which block our blood vessels, and that in turn leads to the myriad of life-changing and life-threatening consequences of this disease. So blockage of the fine blood vessels throughout the body can lead to numbness, tingling, even pain in the hands and feet. It can lead to impotence. And as I mentioned before, it can cause bleeding inside the eyes. But the other important complication of diabetes on the eyes is what we call diabetic macular edema. And here we have a cross-section through the central vision area of the retina in a patient with type 2 diabetes. And you can see at the top page, on the top right, this is the cross-section through the central vision area of the right eye, and that's how it should look. And down below, you can see that raised area, that's swelling within the tissues of the central vision area in the patient's left eye. So this is due to damage to the fine blood vessels around the central vision area, and you get leakage of fluid, and that's what causes the blurring and distortion of the vision. These days, we treat this with an antibody which is injected into the eye. And it helps to seal up those leaky blood vessels and hopefully allow the swelling to reabsorb and the vision to recover. This graph shows that from 2016, when we first started giving injections for diabetic macular edema, you can see the steady increase, which reflects the growing epidemic that is type 2 diabetes. And just last year, there were over 93,000 injections performed for diabetic macular edema in Australia. I find that quite staggering. So diabetes also causes damage to the fine blood vessels of the kidney, and this in turn leads to kidney failure. And kidney failure requires filtering of the blood through dialysis. And this might be up to 7 hours a day, 4 days a week. And I've calculated that in Australia, every year, there are over 60,000 hours spent by patients with type 2 diabetes having their blood filtered by dialysis. Not a great way to spend your life. And think of those lost hours of time spent with the family, in your career, or doing the things that you love. So damage to the larger blood vessels throughout the body can have very serious consequences. Damage to the blood vessels which supply the legs can ultimately lead to gangrene. And this is the gangrenous foot in a patient with type 2 diabetes. And such a foot, sadly, needs to be amputated. In Australia, every year, we're seeing over 4,000 amputations performed for gangrene due to type 2 diabetes. And here's our friend, Neil Hansell, in his hospital bed the day after his left leg was amputated. In fact, it was the 9th amputation over a 14-month period. What a terrible way to spend your life. And Neil has also had a heart attack. And so type 2 diabetes is also a deadly disease. It can also cause stroke. In fact, it's the 6th biggest killer in our society, and also plays a critical role in the top 3 killers: heart attack, dementia, and stroke. It's also an incredibly expensive disease, costing our health system close to $20 billion every single year. For diabetes, its treatment, its complications, and the lost productivity in the workforce. So how did this all arise? Well, humans are hardwired to love and seek out sweet things. It's an ancient survival mechanism that helped our early ancestors to survive extended periods of fasting, which were common in early humans. It also allowed them to avoid bitter and potentially poisonous foodstuffs in their environment. Prior to the 1600s, sugar was an expensive commodity. It was the preserve of healers and holy men, and an indulgence that could only be afforded by the wealthy and the powerful. Over the next 300 years, though, the rising availability and popularity of sugar due to the booming sugar trade led to diminishing costs, turning sugar from a luxury item to an everyday necessity. Things took a turn for the worse, though, in 1980, when the dietary guidelines for Americans was released. In the decades after World War II, it was noted a rise in heart attacks, and it was thought that this was due to a fatty diet causing fatty blockage of the arteries of the heart. And on no scientific evidence whatsoever, there was a recommendation to reduce the fat in our food to 30% and increase the carbs to 60%. And rather than see a downturn in heart disease soared, along with the type 2 diabetes. In fact, globally, in the 40 years since 1980, there's been a 4-fold increase in type 2 diabetes. And this has been even more profound in some countries and communities. In China, for example, there's been more than a 10-fold increase in type 2 diabetes. And this is somewhat paradoxical because the Chinese diet is high in refined carbohydrates in the form of white rice. But what we've seen in China in recent times is a a steady increase in sugar consumption, which is amounting to about 5% every year. And it's also been devastating to Aboriginal communities. We've seen an 80-fold increase in type 2 diabetes in this disadvantaged community. And I have no doubt that a diet that's high in sugar, refined carbohydrates, and highly processed foods is driving this. And once again, in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Guide to Healthy Eating, we can certainly spy a number of refined carbohydrates, processed foods, and foods that are relatively high in sugar content. And in Australia, there are some communities, such as Greater Western Sydney, where half of the adults have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes for the first time in history. And what's also very concerning is that we're seeing type 2 diabetes in kids. This is just a slide showing the increased prevalence of diabetes in Western Sydney. The red areas are the highest prevalence of type 2 diabetes. So I mentioned we're seeing this problem in kids. This was a disease that was formerly called maturity onset diabetes. But now in Australia, there are over 1,100 Aussie children and teens with type 2 diabetes. And this is actually a worldwide problem. In 2001, less than 3% of all new cases of diabetes was due to type 2 diabetes. And yet 10 years later, 45%, nearly half, due to type 2 diabetes. So what are we going to do about this? Well, if we're going to call type 2 diabetes a dietary disease, then surely there's a dietary cure. It should be as simple as reducing our intake of sugar, of refined carbohydrates, and highly processed foods. And it should be that easy, but there are a number of confounding factors that make it a more difficult thing to achieve. And I call them the 5 A's of sugar toxicity. And these are addiction, alleviation, accessibility, addition, and advertising. And I'd just like to go through each of these in turn. So firstly, addiction. Sugar is highly addictive. It's been shown to be as addictive as nicotine. Its consumption activates the reward center in our brains, leading to the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. It's what makes us feel good. It's what makes us want to do it again. And it's what gives us those cravings. And like drugs, the more we ingest, the more we need to consume to give us that feel-good hit. It's a vicious cycle that's very hard to break. The second A is alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress or to make us feel better when we're down. During anxious times, the body is flooded with cortisol. It's a stress hormone released by the brain. And the body needs to balance that cortisol reaction with feel-good chemicals such as dopamine. And of course, sugar does a really good job of that. The third A is accessibility. Sugar is cheap, and sugar is quite literally everywhere these days in our lives. You can't walk into most service stations without being confronted by a wall of confectionery, and you can't check out from most supermarkets without being enticed by half-price soft drinks and confectionery. In fact, 90% of all food at checkouts is discretionary junk food, and 30% of it is on sale in any one week in the major supermarket chains in Australia. The fourth A is addition. An astronomical amount of sugar is added to our food and drink, something in the order of 75%. And this is particularly problematic in remote communities where sugary food and drinks are in abundance and fresh and healthy foods are scarce and expensive. The final A is advertising. Our world is flooded with TV commercials and ads for sugary products, often in the most insidious of ways. And this has been going on for decades. So how are we going to deal with this enormous and growing problem in our society? Well, to me, it's going to take resilience. And when I talk about resilience, I like to use the analogy of Mr. Spock from Star Trek. He's a very cool-headed, resilient character. And I know what he'd do. He'd look to the smoking epidemic to see what's causing its decline. Back when Spock first graced our screens in the 1950s, smoking was socially acceptable. In fact, in the years after World War II, something like 80% of all men smoked cigarettes. Have a look at this ad for candy cigarettes from the 50s and the caption, "Just like Dad." The realisation of the health dangers of smoking in the 60s and the subsequent banning of advertising for cigarettes, the taxing of tobacco products, and the rollout of hard-hitting and graphic awareness strategies such as these that we all know and remember very well, and still see to this day, they've all made smoking socially unacceptable. And as a result, smoking-related diseases and deaths are on the decline in most countries. Not so sugar consumption, type 2 diabetes, and its complications, which are all on the rise. So, like we've done for smoking, we need to engage a resilient approach in dealing with these 5 A's of sugar toxicity. So let's look at these once again, each in turn. For addiction and alleviation, it's about being personally aware that sugar is highly addictive and that we're using it to alleviate stress. And for the final 3, it's about accountability of business, of industry, and of government to do the right thing by the people of Australia. So let's look at addiction firstly. I suspect much of the world is addicted to sugar. I certainly was, and probably still am. The thing that I love the most, though, is ice cream. The bigger the better. The worst punishment I could receive as a child was to be sent to my bed after dinner without ice cream. And there's rarely been a day since when I haven't had this treat. But it's important to remember that sugar addiction can be beaten. For me, it was about giving up the heavily sugared products in my diet, the chocolate and confectionaries, soft drinks and fruit juices, biscuits and cake, and sadly, yes, the ice cream. And when I did that, I immediately got withdrawal symptoms. They started on day 1. I was really cranky and irritable. I had a headache, my clouded thoughts, and I was quite fatigued. It was actually much tougher than a coffee withdrawal. And over the next 3 days, the symptoms picked up, and along with it came the intense cravings. But after day 3, the symptoms started to ease off. And these days I can walk past my freezer after dinner and not have to reach in and grab an ice cream. And I'm not wanting to be evangelizing about this. I still want to be able to enjoy a dessert if I go out to dinner with my family or friends. I still want to be able to receive a mint chocolate frog for my birthday. And I still want to be able to enjoy a bowl of ice cream, just not every night. For me, it's a physical dependency. But for many people, I suspect there may be a deeper psychological addiction, and we might need to engage helplines and self-help groups and psychological counselling, as we did, and as we still do, for cigarette smoking and alcohol. The second A is alleviation. Rather than reaching for that block of chocolate or that second pack of cream biscuits when you're feeling down, why not take the healthier option? Go for a walk or a ride or run out in nature, somewhere beautiful. Listen to your favourite musical playlist, or reach out and do a good deed for someone else. These have all been shown to be as effective as sugar in countering that cortisol reaction that's flooding our bodies during anxious times. The third A is accessibility, and there are a number of strategies that we can utilise here. These were 2 vending machines that I saw in the Adelaide Medical and Dental School quite recently, and they were full to the brim with sugary products. And I wrote to the dean asking that these be removed from the study area in the school. In fact, I've written to all of the universities in South Australia. And at this stage, I've only heard back from UniSA, who are planning to take positive action. And another of the obvious strategies would be to remove sugary products from checkout counters of stores and supermarkets, where they're preying on our addictions. They're preying on our children, the vulnerable and the addicted. And I've actually written to all the major supermarket chains in this country and a number of other stores. And at this stage, I've only had a positive response from Australia Post. But I was pleased to see the other day at the Foodland store in Norwood, the confectionery counter had been replaced with a counter full of packaged nuts. The fourth A is addition. I don't know about you, but I can barely read those nutritional labels on the packets of food, let alone understand them. And they certainly don't tell us the amount of added sugar contained within. We have a health star rating system, which is flawed. It's flawed because it's only taken up by 30% of manufacturers. And what manufacturer would put an unhealthy label on a foodstuff that it's trying to sell? It's also flawed because a number of the products get a healthy rating and they're inherently unhealthy. And orange juice is one of these. A glass of sweetened orange juice has almost as much sugar as a glass of cola. And I'd like to see graphic depictions of the amount of sugar contained within some of our foodstuffs. I think that would really put people off consuming these things. And I was delighted to see quite recently that our Australian Guide to Healthy Eating and our Australian Dietary Guidelines are currently being reviewed. And hopefully we'll see a reduction in the refined carbohydrates in the next version. And this is where the contentious issue of taxing comes in, but there's some solid evidence and good reasoning behind it. In the 10 years leading up to 2017, there was a 30% increase in sugary drink consumption in Australia. And sugary drink consumption has been definitely linked to type 2 diabetes in a number of studies. And a levy, or a tax on sugary drinks, has also been shown to reduce purchase and consumption in a number of studies in a number of countries. So it certainly makes sense to me. And a 20% levy on sugary drinks in Australia has been modelled to show that it would raise over $600 million, and we could use that then to fund health awareness initiatives and health inequalities that most definitely exist in our society. And the final A is advertising. And again, there are a number of strategies that we could use here. And one of the most important and obvious is to remove TV commercials for sugary products during those hours when our kids are exposed to the TV. Another one would be to remove ads for sugary products from government buildings and services such as buses and trams. And we need to replace that with a far-reaching strategy to raise awareness amongst the Australian public of the multitude of health dangers of excessive sugar consumption, not just obesity and type 2 diabetes, but also tooth decay. So sugar is the leading cause of dental caries in our society. We also need to see positive messages that type 2 diabetes is a preventable dietary disease. We also need to see that type 2 diabetes is reversible in many people. This is absolutely critical, something that many people don't actually know. A recent study showed that with a low carb, low sugar diet, more than half of the patients with type 2 diabetes were able to reverse their disease in a 10-week period. We also need very important messages such as the natural saturated fats in our diet have never been shown to cause cardiovascular disease. Products such as what you see here on the screen, but also whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs, and dark chocolate. They're all saturated fatty acid-rich foods that have not been associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And we should also be encouraged to eat real food. And one of the other really important things I believe is that we need to see hard-hitting ads on TV commercials. I'm now going to show you an ad that I created for Sight for All in 2018.
I should have kept my medication up, and I should have followed the plans that were given to me by my doctors. I woke up one morning completely blind. Thought I was dreaming, went back to sleep for an hour, woke up and I was still completely blocked off. My wife's face when we went to bed. That was the last clear image I had.
It's a heart-wrenching story, isn't it? That ad played nationally on Channel 7 for about 6 weeks in late 2018. But it played as a community service announcement, so perhaps only seen in the wee hours of the morning. I believe such ads need to be played across all channels during prime time and for extended periods. To me, this is all about education. These days, would you leave a pack of cigarettes on the kitchen counter for your kids to enjoy? Absolutely not. So why leave a bowl of sugary treats? You need to replace that bowl of sugary treats with a bowl of nuts. We need to educate our kids. Yet we can't educate our kids until we know and understand ourselves. And how about those soft drinks in our fridge? Perhaps this is their gloomy future. Perhaps like smoking, you need to make sugary drinks socially unacceptable. I'm now going to leave you with one last message from Neil Hansell from his hospital bed the day after his left leg was amputated.
I had a little joke the other day, and I put my hand up and I had a grain of sugar between my fingers, and I said, "Meet my killer." And people were trying to see what was in my fingers, and all it was 1 grain of salt, 1 grain of sugar. And that's what it takes. You know, we, as a society, we have to do something. We've got to make people aware that the more sugar we intake, the worse this is going to get. And it's not good. It's not good.
It's not good, is it? As an eye specialist, I never want to see another patient going needlessly blind due to their diabetes. As a doctor, we shouldn't be seeing the life-changing and life-threatening complications of a preventable dietary disease. And as Australians, we should be putting an end to type 2 diabetes. Thank you very much. I'm now just going to leave you with one last slide. I'd be delighted if you would follow Sight for All on social media. You can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, and you're most welcome to follow my journey as Australian of the Year. So thanks once again for joining in, and I wish you all the very best. I'm now going to stop sharing the screen.